Imagine an underground room where the air is so dense it seems to carry centuries of secrets. The only light comes from torches attached to stone walls, projecting distorted shadows that move like ancient specters. In the center of the room, there is a circular table made of darkened wood, marked by symbols that do not appear in any official manual of the order. The distant sound of footsteps echoes above, on some level of the temple, but down here, a silence reigns that does not belong to the outside world. The Knights Templar were known for their discipline, faith, and fearlessness. But what few knew, and what was never written in the records permitted by the Church, is that the order guarded rituals so complex, so rooted in forbidden symbolism, that only the oldest or most trusted members were allowed to witness them. What began as initiation ceremonies soon became something deeper, a process of transformation, of renunciation, of total surrender to the institution. On the surface, the Templars were warriors. Underground, they were something else. There, between cold walls that muffled any sound, power circulated differently. Words were whispered in languages that many novices did not even recognize. Objects were placed in the center, as if they carried their own strength. And every small action seemed to obey a logic that escaped external eyes, a logic that the Church always feared, always watched, but never managed to extinguish completely. What you are about to hear is not myth, nor religious propaganda. It is what has survived in hidden accounts, in erased testimonies, in fragments that should never see the light. The truth that the Church preferred not to tell. To understand why these rituals existed, it is necessary to look beyond the heroic surface of the Templars and recognize the human weight that lived behind the armor. Many of the men who joined the order carried deep losses, families destroyed by wars, lands taken, lives marked by violence. Others sought redemption for acts they could not forget, and there were also those who simply sought a place where their pain could be transformed into purpose. Templar life demanded complete renunciation. They surrendered their name, their freedom, their individual will. They slept in silence, ate in silence, obeyed in silence. And for many of them, this silence was the only possible refuge in a world that had broken them. That is why the hidden rituals found fertile ground. They were not just ceremonies. They were mechanisms of emotional survival, ways of creating belonging in men who had already lost everything. Human suffering, when compressed for years, needs structure to avoid exploding. The order provided this structure, but also used it as a tool of control. The Templars were trained to believe that their pain brought them closer to God, that their wounds were part of a greater plan, that their fears were purified by discipline. And paradoxically, the more suffering they arrived with, the more easily they surrendered to the hidden rituals, not because they understood, but because they needed to believe. This mixture of faith, trauma, and submission explains why so many accepted practices that they would never dare to mention, and why the Church, realizing the psychological power that the order accumulated, feared so much what it could not control. The rise of the Templars was as rapid as it was unsettling. In less than a century, the order went from being a small group of 9 poor knights to becoming a military, economic, and spiritual force that rivaled kings and even the Church itself. They controlled trade routes, coffers of entire kingdoms, impregnable fortresses, letters of credit that anticipated what we call banks today. It was too much power in the hands of men who answered only to their own grand master. The Church watched everything with growing attention. The Templars were officially their spiritual children, but in practice, they became an autonomous institution with their own laws, internal tribunals, and a communication network that no bishop could penetrate. It was in this environment of extreme discipline and unsettling independence that the hidden rituals arose, ceremonies that reinforced internal cohesion, absolute secrecy, and unconditional obedience. The psychology of the order was built on 3 pillars: devotion, fear, and belonging. A Templar swore to abandon his own life in the name of the mission. He was shaped to see the world as a permanent battlefield between light and shadow. He was instructed to trust only his brothers, never strangers, never the outside world. This spiritual isolation created fertile ground for practices that, under another context, would seem unbearable. The rituals, in turn, did not serve only as religious ceremonies. They functioned as a mechanism of emotional and political control. The more secrecy involved the order, the more power it seemed to have, and the more the Church tried to understand what was happening behind closed doors, the less it could. It is at this intersection between faith, paranoia, and power that the hidden rituals were born and that many were erased from history. The ceremony began long before any torch was lit. It began in silence. The novices were led through the narrow corridors of a Templar fortress where the air smelled of wet stone and burnt oil. Their footsteps echoed like muffled drum beats, marking the beginning of a walk of no return. Along the walls, symbols engraved discreetly observed every movement. Stylized crosses, circular marks, inscriptions that did not appear on the public altars of the order. Finally, they arrived before a heavy door, reinforced with iron. Two experienced knights guarded the threshold, motionless, with expressions so rigid that they seemed sculpted on their faces. The door opened slowly, creaking as if it carried the weight of accumulated secrets. Inside, the hall was illuminated only by a row of low lamps, arranged in a circle. In the center, an object covered by dark fabric. The novices were instructed not to look directly at it. The oldest figures of the order were already positioned, with white cloaks that contrasted violently with the darkness around them. There were no words of welcome, no kindness, just a movement of the hand indicating where each novice should kneel. The silence was so absolute that one could hear the trembling breath of the newcomers. Then, one of the officers slowly removed the fabric that covered the object in the center. Some accounts describe that it was not something bloody, but symbolic, an ancient reliquary, a fragment of wood, or even something that represented abandonment and renunciation. The goal was not to shock the body, but to reach the mind. It was the moment when the novices realized that they were facing something that would never be explained in words. The ritual had not started yet, but the transformation already had. The Templar ritual, far from romantic versions, functioned as a psychological dismantling mechanism. The order knew that to create absolutely loyal knights, it was necessary to break part of the identity they brought with them. And this was not done with external violence, but with silent manipulation and emotional precision. First came the isolation. For days, the novices were kept away from the other brothers, deprived of conversations and any family reference. Prolonged loneliness weakened internal resistances and made the mind more permeable to new narratives. Then came the questions, repeated, indirect, almost hypnotic. Questions about faith, about fear, about their own dignity. Each answer was observed, measured, catalogued. The most symbolic stage arose in the center of the room, before the ritual object. The goal was not idolatry, as many imagine, but psychological submission, renouncing the previous identity, their own will, the idea that they belonged to the outside world. Accounts describe moments when the officers walked in a circle around the novices, whispering phrases that spoke of sacrifice, of death of the ego, of abandonment of everything that was not the order. To reinforce the power of the institution, certain practices involved ritualized humiliation, not physical, but emotional. The novice was led to declare imperfections, weaknesses, and sins that he may not even have committed. The goal was not punishment, but to create dependence. A man who reveals his deepest secrets becomes vulnerable, and a vulnerable man who has nowhere to run transforms into the ideal soldier. Thus, the Templar ritual did not need instruments of pain to function. It was a perfect machine for shaping minds and erasing entire men to rebuild them as a silent part of the order. The breaking point arose when the novice, kneeling before the circle of lamps, realized that there was no turning back. It was the exact moment when everything he believed he knew about faith, honor, and devotion began to unravel. One of the officers approached slowly, placing his hand on his shoulder, a gesture that on the outside seemed like consolation, but on the inside meant absolute surrender. In some ceremonies, the novice was asked to repeat vows that went beyond military obedience. They were words that demanded total surrender, of will, of thought, of silence. He promised to give up not only earthly life, but any personal ambition that could compete with the order. It was at this moment that many trembled, not out of fear of physical punishment, but out of the realization that they were renouncing themselves. There are accounts that describe a second symbolic gesture. The officer raised the novice's face with 2 fingers, forcing him to face the central flame. The flickering light reflected in the eyes full of uncertainty, and there, under the observation of the elders, the emotional fracture happened. There was no scream, no visible pain. There was only the devastating perception that everything that would come next would be decided by hands that were no longer his own. Some novices described a feeling of emptiness, as if a part of their identity had been torn away without physical contact. Others spoke of a strange, almost anesthetic calm, as if they had been absorbed by something greater than themselves. Whatever the reaction, everyone knew that that moment marked the death of the man and the birth of the Templar. This was the true forbidden rite, the moment when the mind broke and surrendered to the silence of the order. After the ritual ended, the Templar fortress returned to its usual rhythm: firm steps, murmured prayers, silent training in the inner courtyard. But the newly initiated men never returned the same. They walked more rigidly, spoke less, observed more. The transformation was not just symbolic, it was psychological. The hidden rituals created soldiers who no longer belonged to the outside world. They were, first and foremost, property of the order. Over time, this pattern began to arouse unease in kings and bishops. The Templars seemed moved by a loyalty that surpassed any earthly border. This made them efficient and dangerous. Their growing autonomy bothered the Church, which could not penetrate the internal secrets of the order, and it bothered the monarchs even more, who saw their own armies weaken while the Templars became an independent, almost sovereign force. It was in this tension that the accusations, the rumors, the persecutions were born. The Church, unable to control what it did not understand, decided to destroy the order, not for the rituals themselves, but for what they represented: men whose minds belonged to a rival institution. During the trials, many Templars spoke, under torture, of symbolic practices that they never knew how to fully explain. Others remained silent until the end, protecting secrets that they may not even remember where they came from. The echo of these rituals survives to this day. Historians still debate what was true, what was exaggeration, and what was political invention. But one thing remains indisputable. The order created such a deep system of psychological formation that its influence continued long after its ashes were scattered. The rituals disappeared, but their silence never died. At the end of this underground journey, we realize that the hidden rituals of the Templars were not just ceremonies lost in time, but deep reflections of how power shapes minds when no one is watching. The Church feared these rituals not out of superstition, but because they created men who did not answer to crowns, bishops, or kingdoms, only to the order, and any institution capable of generating absolute loyalty inevitably becomes a threat. The Templars mastered the art of transforming trauma into discipline, loneliness into belonging, pain into devotion. They created a system so complex, so silently effective, that not even its destruction was able to erase it completely. Fragments remained, burned documents, extracted confessions, symbols forgotten in abandoned fortresses. But the echo remains, because when an institution shapes souls instead of soldiers, its influence resists history. The underground where the lamps flickered may no longer exist. The circular table may have turned to dust, but the men who knelt there left a mark that has crossed centuries. The awareness that absolute power is never exercised in broad daylight. It prefers the shadows. It prefers secrecy. It prefers silence. And so, one last question remains, the same one that troubles historians, theologians, and psychologists to this day. What remains hidden when institutions decide that some truths should not be revealed? The Templars disappeared, but the shadow of their rituals remains alive.